Well, it's sad to get to the end of what has been a great experience for all of us. But this lecture is entitled Politics, and our university has had a long and distinguished tradition of studying South Asian politics that I thought I'd at least mention. This tradition in recent years has included the famous team of Suzanne and Lloyd Rudolph. It includes today, in a historical mode, my wonderful colleague and friend Dipesh Chakrabarti. It includes as well some scholars of India who have become political because of events and without their own intention, a lead example being Wendy Doniger, whose book on Hinduism was withdrawn by Penguin during litigation over a proposed ban for offending the feelings of Hindus. And there are many, so many other wonderful scholars of Indian politics that I can't list them all, and so I just apologize to all of them for that. In our law school, we also have a fine group of scholars concerned with Indian law and politics is one of the major themes of our new University of Chicago Research Center in Delhi, which teams up University of Chicago scholars with scholars in India for the purposes of collaborative research and learning. But the novel has its own tale to tell to politics. And in my own work on Indian politics, I find myself drawn always to the Indian novel, with its earlier figures such as Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Mulk Raj Anand, and above all, for me, the great Rabindranath Tagore, and with its many fine contemporary voices, among whom, of course, Amitav Ghosh is an acknowledged leader. The novelists I've just mentioned certainly address political themes, caste, nationhood, the status of women. But because they are distinguished novelists, not writers of tracts, they approach politics from the inside out, looking at events through the lens of human struggles to live and human emotions. For example, Tagore's Gare Baire, The Home and the World, is certainly a novel of politics, dealing as it does with contrasting visions of nation building, with women's independence, and with religious and economic tensions. But because it's a very fine novel, it's not a political tract, it's a tragedy of human aspiration, love, and error. In my admiring reading of Amitav Ghosh's novels, I've seen politics as playing a double role vis-a-vis human longing and striving, what I might call the external and what I might call the internal. On the one hand, politics can appear frustratingly, incomprehensibly external, something that imposes strange categories and lines and limits on the characters, whose human aims politics fails utterly to take into account. I think, for example, of the wonderful character of the grandmother in the Shadow Lines, who, about to go home to her birthplace, Dhaka, suddenly finds that she has to fill out a lot of forms, and she discovers on these forms that her birthplace, Dhaka, and her nationality, Indian, don't match up. And here's a quote: "One evening when we were sitting out in the garden, she wanted to know whether she would be able to see the border between India and East Pakistan from the plane. When my father laughed and said, 'Why, did she really think the border was a long black line with green on one side and scarlet on the other, like it was a school atlas?' she was not so much offended as puzzled," end quote. The other and complementary role that politics plays is all too deeply internal, creating harrowing and at times tragic dilemmas for honorable characters caught up in the whirl of changing times. I think here of Arjun in The Glass Palace, who's an officer in the British Army, but he's pressed by Indian nationalists to desert and join the rebel nationalist army. His parting discussion of the nature of loyalty with his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Buckland, is surely political, but in the deeper sense of being excruciatingly real and personal, as both men struggle to inhabit an honest and self-respecting politics in a moment of world change. I found that I was weeping as I listened to this on my earphone as I ran along the lakeshore, and people were looking at me very oddly. These examples will show all of you the rich experiences in store for those of you who haven't read these and other novels of Amitav Ghosh. But now tonight, we're in of course, as you all know who've heard the lectures to this point, for a treat of a different but closely related sort, as Ghosh concludes his very impressive series of lectures on global warming.
Thank you very much, Martha, for that very generous and kind introduction. And once again, I'd like to thank you all for what has been a wonderful stay for us here in Chicago. And thank you all for making this a really memorable occasion. In his 2009 essay on climate change and the writing of history, Dipesh Chakraborty suggests that the emergence of humanity as a geological force has dissolved the distinction between the natural and the human, on which the study of the humanities is based in the Western tradition. This tradition is, of course, now more or less universal, since it's come to be adopted as an educational norm around the world. In the absence of that distinction, Dipesh asks, how is history to be written? Can the idea of humans as the sole makers of their history survive intact if another protagonist, the Earth, is shown to be decisively implicated in the making of our destiny? These questions could be posed with equal force in relation to art and literature, particularly in regard to the 20th century, when there was a radical turn away from the non-human to the human, from the figurative towards the abstract. It was at this time that human consciousness, agency, and identity became central to every kind of aesthetic enterprise. I've been arguing that Asia has a very special role within climate change. And it's in this realm, too, Asia has a special role. The questions that animated, obsessed, and haunted thinkers and writers, the thinkers and writers of 20th century Asia, were precisely those that related to the modern, in literature and art, as well as matters of politics and economics. There, too, the appeal of modernity lay in its promises of freedom and universality. In their embrace of modernity, Asian writers and artists created ruptures that radically reconfigured the region's literature, art, architecture, and so on. In Asia, as elsewhere, this meant that the abstract and the formal gained ascendancy over the figurative and the iconographic. It meant also that many traditions, including those that accorded the non-human a special salience, were pushed aside. Here, as elsewhere, freedom came to be seen as a way of transcending the material, of exploring new regions of the mind, spirit, emotion, consciousness, interiority. Freedom became a quantity that resided entirely in the minds, bodies, and desires of human beings. But now, when we look back upon that time, with our gaze reversed, having woken against our will, to the knowledge that we have always been watched and judged by other eyes, what stands out? Is it possible that the arts and literature of this time will be thought remarkable not for their daring, nor for their championing of freedom, but rather because of their complicity in the great derangement? If even the possibility of such a judgment seems shocking, it's because we have come to accept that the front ranks of the arts are in some ways in advance of mainstream culture. That artists and writers are able to look ahead, not just in aesthetic matters, but also in regard to public affairs. Writers and artists have themselves embraced this role with increasing fervor through the 20th century, and never more so than in the period in which carbon emissions were accelerating. Let's imagine for a moment, just as a thought experiment, that a graph could be drawn of the political engagements of writers and artists through the 20th century and into the 21st. It's quite likely, I suspect, that such a graph would closely resemble a chart of carbon emissions over the same period. That is to say, the line would indicate a steep and steady rise over the decades, with a few sudden and dramatic upsurges. The First World War would represent one such escalation, the rise in industrial and military activity being mirrored by an enormous outpouring of literature, much of it explicitly political. During the interwar years, too, the graphs would remain on roughly parallel tracks, a rise in worldwide industrial activity being matched by the increasingly visible involvement of writers with political movements such as socialism, communism, anti-fascism, nationalism, and anti-imperialism. Lorca, Brecht, Orwell, Lu Xun, and Tagore being cases to point. Only in the early post-war decades would there be a marked divergence in the two graphs, with the political engagements of writers outpacing the rise in the rate of emissions. The large-scale industrialization of Asia had yet to begin, after all, while writers around the world were broadening their political engagements on all fronts at this time. We need think only of the progressive writers movement in India and Pakistan, of decolonization and Sartre, James Baldwin and the civil rights movement, the Beats and the student uprisings of the 60s, the persecution of Pramodia Anantatur in Indonesia, and of Solzhenitsyn in the Soviet Union. This was a time when writers were in the forefront of every political movement around the world. Not till the 1980s would the graphs again converge, and then too, not because of any diminution in the political energies of writers and artists, but only because the rate of emissions from Asia had begun its steady upwards climb. But in this period again, writers were in the vanguard of many movements, feminism and gay rights being but two of them. This was also a time in which the paradoxical coupling of the processes of decolonization on the one hand and the increasing hegemony of the English language on the other made it possible for writers like myself to enter the global literary mainstream in a way that had not been possible in the preceding 2 centuries. At the same time, changes in technologies of communication and a rapid growth in networks of translation served to internationalize both politics and literature to a point where it could be said that Goethe's vision of a world literature had come close to being realized. I can attest from my own experience that this period, when an exploding rate of carbon emissions was rewriting the planet's destiny, was a breathtakingly exciting time in which to launch upon a career as a writer. Not the least aspect of this was the prospect of being ahead, en avant, of being a part, in effect, of an avant-garde, a conception that has been one of the animating forces of the literary and artistic imagination since the start of the 20th century. To want to be ahead and to celebrate and mythify this endeavor is indeed one of the most powerful impulses of modernity itself. In the words of Bruno Latour, to be modern is to envision time as irreversible, to think of it as a progression that is forever propelled forwards by revolutionary ruptures, which are in turn conceived of on the analogy of scientific innovations, each of which is thought to render its predecessor obsolete. And obsolescence is indeed modernity's equivalent of perdition and hellfire. That is why this era's most potent words of damnation, passed down in a smooth, unbroken relay from Hegel and Marx to President Obama, is the malediction of being on the wrong side of history. That the world's most powerful leader should hurl these words at his enemies in much the same way that curses and imprecations were once used by kings, priests, and shamans is, of course, a disavowal of the very irreversibility of time that the mantra invokes. For is it not also an acknowledgement of the power that words have possessed through the ages, of striking fear into the hearts of foes, of conjuring up visions of terror with curses and maledictions? And for modern man, terror is exactly what is evoked by the fear of being left behind, of being backward. There is perhaps no better means of tracking the diffusion of modernity across the globe than by charting the widening grip of this fear, which was nowhere more powerfully felt than in the places that were most visibly marked by the stigmata of backwardness. It was what drove artists and writers in Asia, Africa, and the Arab world to go to extraordinary lengths to keep up with each iteration of modernity in the arts, surrealism, existentialism, and so on. And far from diminishing over time, that impulse gathered strength through the 20th century, so that writers of my generation were, if anything, even less impervious to its power than our predecessors. We watched bedazzled as a chain of isms, structuralism, postmodernism, postcolonialism, flashed past our eyes with ever-increasing speed. This is why it comes as a surprise, a shock really, to look back upon that period of surging carbon emissions and recognize that very few, and I don't exempt myself from this, very few of the literary minds of that intensely engagé period were alive to the archaic voice whose rumblings, once familiar, had now become inaudible to humanity, that of the earth and its atmosphere. I don't mean to imply that there were no manifestations of a general sense of anxiety and foreboding in the literature of that time, nor do I mean to suggest that mankind had ceased to be haunted by intuitions of apocalypse. These were certainly no less abundant in the last few decades than they have been since stories were first told. But it's when I try to think of writers whose imaginative work communicated a more specific sense of the accelerating changes in our environment that I find myself at a loss. Of literary novelists writing in English, only a handful of names come to mind. Margaret Atwood, Kurt Vonnegut Jr., Barbara Kingsolver, Doris Lessing, Cormac McCarthy, and T. Corrigan Boyle. No doubt many other names could be added to this. But even if the above list were to be expanded 100-fold or more, it would remain true, I think, that the literary mainstream, even as it was becoming more engagé on many fronts, remained just as unaware of the crisis on our doorstep as the population at large. In this regard, the avant-garde, far from being ahead, was clearly a laggard. Could it be then that the same process that inaugurated the rising death spiral of carbon emissions also ensured, in an uncannily clever gesture of self-protection, that the artists, writers, and poets of that era would go racing off in directions that would actually blind them to exactly that which they thought they were seeing, that is to say, what lay en avant, what was to come? And if this were so, would it not be a damning indictment of a vision in which the arts are seen to be moving forever forwards in a dimension of irreversible time by means of innovations brought about by the free pursuit of the imagination? There is, of course, as Moretti notes, a sort of ascetic heroism in such an endeavor. Yet it's now also clear that the more, and I quote, radical and clear-sighted the aesthetic achievements of that time, the more unlivable the world they depict, unquote. Writers are not alone, of course, in having broadened and intensified their political and social engagements over the last couple of decades. This has happened to the entirety of what used to be called the intelligentsia. In no small part has this been brought about by changes in the technology of communication. The internet and the digital media have made the sphere of the political broader and more intrusive than ever before. Today, everybody with a computer and a net connection is an activist. Yet, what I said earlier about literary circles is true also of the intelligentsia, and indeed of circles far beyond. Generally speaking, politicization has not translated into a wider engagement with the crisis of climate change. The lack of a transitive connection between political mobilization on the one hand and global warming on the other is nowhere more evident than in the countries of South Asia, all of which are extraordinarily vulnerable to climate change. In the last few decades, South Asia has become very highly politicized. Great numbers take to the streets to express indignation and outrage over a wide range of issues. On television channels and the social media, people speak their minds ever more stridently. Yet, the impacts of global warming, which have already begun to affect the lives of tens of millions of people across the subcontinent, hardly ever finds a mention in the public sphere. Instead, political energy has increasingly come to be focused on issues that relate in one way or another to questions of identity, religion, caste, ethnicity, language, gender rights, and so on. The divergence between the public sphere and the common interest suggests that what has come about is a change in the nature of politics itself. The political is no longer about the common weal or the body politic and the manner of its existence. It is about something else. What then is that something? A similar question could be posed in relation to literature. Why is the literary imaginary increasingly open to a certain conception of the political while remaining closed to an issue that concerns our collective survival? Here again, the trajectory of the modern novel represents, I think, a special case of a broader cultural phenomenon. The essence of this phenomenon is again captured by the words that John Updike used to characterize the modern novel: individual moral adventure. I've already addressed one of the implications of this conception of the novel, the manner in which it banishes the collective from the territory of the fictional imagination. I want to attend now to another aspect of it, the implications of the word moral. We encounter this word very frequently today in relation to fiction as well as politics. In my view, the notion of the moral is the hinge that has made possible the joining of the political and the literary imaginary. This conjuncture has come about, I believe, because politics too has come to be thought of as an individual moral adventure, in the sense of being an interior journey guided by the conscience. The word moral derives from a Latin root signifying custom or mores. Connotations of aristocratic usages may well, as Nietzsche famously argued, have been implicit in it. It was not until the late 16th century that the word came to be associated with goodness and virtue, and it was surely no coincidence that this was the century of the Protestant Reformation. At that time, goodness and virtue were conceived of as religious or spiritual qualities. But today, the word moral draws its force primarily from the domain of the political. But this is not a politics that is principally concerned with the ordering of public affairs. It's a politics that is, in the first instance, personal. Just as novels have come to be seen as narratives of identity, so too has politics become, for many, a search for personal authenticity, a journey of self-discovery. Although the evolution of the term moral has brought it squarely into the secular domain, the term continues to be powerfully marked by its origins, which clearly lie within Christianity and particularly Protestantism. The moral political, as thus conceived, is essentially Protestantism without a God. It commits its votaries to believing in perfectibility, individual redemption, and a never-ending journey to a shining city on a hill, built in this instance not by a deity but by democracy. This is a vision of the world as a secular church, where all congregants offer testimony about their journeys of self-discovery. This imagining of the world has profound consequences for fiction as well as the body politic. Fiction, for one, comes to be reimagined in such a way that it becomes a form of bearing witness, of testifying, and of charting the career of the conscience. Thus do sincerity and authenticity become, in politics as in literature, the greatest of virtues. No wonder then that one of the literary icons of our age, the novelist Karl Ove Knausgaard, has publicly admitted to a detestation of fiction. His work is perhaps the ultimate example of that secular bearing of the soul that is demanded by the world as church. This then is the paradox and the price of conceiving of the novel as a chronicle of individual moral adventure. Ultimately, it negates fiction itself. And needless to add, there is very little space for the non-human in this journey into the depths of the human soul. For the body politic, this vision of politics as a moral journey has had the consequence of creating an ever-growing divergence between a public sphere of political performance and a separate realm of statecraft and governance, controlled by establishments that are guided by imperatives of their own. And as the public sphere grows ever more performative at every level, from presidential campaigns to online petitions, its ability to influence the actual exercise of power becomes increasingly attenuated. This was starkly evident in the build-up to the Iraq War in 2003, when people across the West took to the streets in unprecedented numbers, but to no avail. In this, as in many other instances, like surveillance, drone warfare, and so on, it is now perfectly clear that in the West, political processes exert very limited influence over the domain of statecraft, so much so that it has even been suggested that, I quote, citizens no longer seriously expect that politicians will really represent their interests and implement their demands. In other words, the public sphere where politics is performed has been largely emptied of content in terms of the exercise of power. As with fiction, it has become a forum for secular testimony, a bearing of the soul in the world as church. But by no means does this imply that the debates and conflicts of the public sphere are frivolous or lacking in earnestness. To the contrary, it would seem that they have become fiercer and more vituperative, even as their ability to influence power has declined. All of this is accompanied by a haunting sense of loss that manifests itself in an ever more desperate yearning to recoup a genuinely participatory politics. Sometimes, as in the surge of support for Donald Trump, this yearning seems to be a manifestation of, I quote, a seemingly schizophrenic condition where citizens want politics to be no more than symbolic, unquote. But that yearning is manifest also in the sudden and unexpected rise of Bernie Sanders in the US and Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. What effect this will have in the long run remains to be seen. But what does this picture of contemporary public politics have to do with global warming? Its relevance lies in the fact that the picture is derived largely from the politics of the Anglosphere, which is central to the dynamics of climate change in every sense. Here are some of the reasons why. To begin with, it needs to be noted that the Anglosphere is no longer a notional entity. It has been given formal expression in the Five Eyes alliance that now binds the intelligence and surveillance structures of the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. The UK-USA security agreement that formalized the arrangement is an implicit acknowledgement of the fact that this alliance undergirds the world's current security architecture. Secondly, the per capita greenhouse gas emissions of the Anglosphere far exceed those of other industrial economies, including those of Europe. Britain's current rate of emissions is lower than those of the other four countries, but her historic emissions are, of course, second only to those of the US. Thirdly, per capita emissions rates are quite similar in all the settler colonies of the Anglosphere, which is itself an indication that their economies represent a specific avatar of capitalism, one that was shaped by Britain's New World conquests. These vast resource-rich territories enabled the rise of an exceptionally predatory and extractive model of capitalism. And the post-war dominance of the Anglosphere has ensured that it was this, rather than other lower-impact models of market economy, that became an aspirational ideal for others elsewhere, as in today's India. Moreover, this model of economy was built upon a set of ideas that could be called the foundational ideology of the Anglosphere. In John Maynard Keynes's description, this ideology consists of the belief that, quote, by the working of natural laws and individuals pursuing their own interests with enlightenment in conditions of freedom, always tend to promote the general interest at the same time. Keynes attributed the triumph of this ideology to the, I quote, peculiar unity of the everyday political philosophy of the 19th century, which brought about a seamless melding of scientific and economic ideas with a certain conception of Christianity. The strength of these associations was such that it was once summed up by the words spoken by the fourth governor of Hong Kong, Sir John Bowring, Jesus Christ is free trade, and free trade is Jesus Christ. In other words, this ideology is not unlike a religious faith, and a millenarian one at that. For those on the right of the political spectrum, the ideology still retains something of that character, with individualism, free trade, and God constituting parts of a whole. Nor is it only the religiously minded whose ideas are shaped by this ideology. It's worth noting that the dominant secular paradigms of ethics in the United States, for example, as in John Rawls's theory of justice, are also founded upon the notion of rational individuals freely maximizing their own interests. The influence that this ideology has had upon the Anglosphere is itself a central aspect of the climate crisis. Since global warming poses a powerful challenge to the idea that the free pursuit of individual interests always leads to the general good, it also challenges a set of beliefs that underlie a deeply rooted cultural identity, one that has enjoyed unparalleled success over the last 2 centuries. Much of the resistance to climate science comes exactly from this, which is probably why the rates of climate change denial are both exceptionally high and strangely uniform throughout the Anglosphere. Yet it is also true that the Anglosphere, the US in particular, has produced the overwhelming bulk of climate science, as well as some of the earliest warnings of global warming. Moreover, many of those who have taken the lead on the issue politically, whether it be as thinkers, theorists, or activists, are from these 5 countries, which together possess some of the most vigorous environmental movements in the world. The tension between these two polarities, widespread denialism on the one hand and vigorous activist movements on the other, now defines the public politics of climate change throughout the Anglosphere. And since identity and performativity are now central to the public imaginary, climate change too has inevitably and improbably become enmeshed within the politics of self-definition, a politics that is entirely rooted within the history and culture of the Anglosphere. This exactly is what American and Australian politicians mean when they speak of climate change negotiations as a threat to our way of life. The enmeshment of global warming with issues of an entirely different order has given a distinctive turn to the politics of climate change in the Anglosphere. Instead of being seen as a phenomenon that requires a practical response, as it largely is in Holland and Denmark, or as an existential danger, as it is in the Maldives and Bangladesh, it has become one of many issues that are clustered along a fault line of extreme polarization. To those on the rightward side of this line, there is but little difference between climate science and socialism and communism and so on. Rush Limbaugh says famously, climate science has become a home for displaced socialists and communists. These associations have generated an extraordinary degree of hostility to climate science, and individual scientists have had to face all manner of threats, harassment, and intimidation. It's a tribute to their courage that they've persevered with their work despite these attacks. The opposition to climate science is not, however, a self-subsisting phenomenon. As Naomi Oreskes, Eric Conway, and others have shown, it's enabled, encouraged, and funded by certain corporations and energy billionaires. These vested interests have systematically spread misinformation and created confusion within the electorate by supporting organizations that are dedicated to that end. The situation is further compounded by the mass media, which have often underplayed or neglected climate change. At times, they've also brought a distinctly skeptical bias to their coverage. That climate skeptics like Rupert Murdoch and corporations that have vested interests in the carbon economy now control large sections of the media is no doubt largely responsible for this. Yet, I think it would be a mistake to assume that denialism within the Anglosphere is only a function of money and manipulation. There is an excess to it that suggests that the climate crisis threatens to unravel something deeper, without which large numbers of people would be at a loss to find meaning in their history and indeed their existence in the world. In other words, the climate crisis has given the lie to Max Weber's contention that modernity brings about the disenchantment of the world. Bruno Latour has long argued that this disenchantment never happened, and this is now plain for all to see. The peculiar unity of the everyday political philosophy of the 19th century is, as Keynes understood very well, an enchantment just as powerful as any dithyrambic mythology. And it is perhaps even harder to disavow because it comes disguised as a truthful description of the world, not as fantasy. But fantasy indeed it is, and as with every kind of enchantment, its power derives largely from the stories it generates. Here again, it is as if Gaia, in its new role as cultural critic, had turned everything upside down, revealing the very idea of bourgeois seriousness and much that rests upon it, fiction, film, theater, to be the smoke that pervades this enchantment. In any event, it is perfectly clear now that in many of the world's most powerful countries, the public sphere is very sharply divided on climate change. Naomi Klein and many others, including Pope Francis, have argued that this is largely to be ascribed to capitalism. And this is, I think, beyond dispute. The imprints of capitalism are clearly to be seen in the confusion and near paralysis that has so marked a feature of the politics of climate change in the public sphere. But strangely, the picture undergoes a complete change when we look to the security establishment. There is no sign here of either denial or confusion. To the contrary, the Pentagon devotes more resources to the study of climate change than any other branch of the US government. As the writer George Marshall notes, quote, "The most rational and considered response to the uncertainties of climate change can be found among military strategists." As General Chuck Wald, former deputy commander of the US European Command, puts it, quote, "There's a problem there, and the military is going to be a part of the solution," unquote. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, is equally blunt. Quote, "The only department in Washington that is clearly and completely seized with the idea that climate change is real is the Department of Defense," unquote. The CIA, too, has produced some of the earliest and most detailed studies of the security implications of climate change. Moreover, the American intelligence services, actually it's true of the Britain and Australia as well, these intelligence services have already made the surveillance of environmentalists and climate activists a priority, which they would scarcely do if there were any doubt about the urgency and magnitude of the problems that lie ahead. The British military posture is similar. This is how a report by an Australian military think tank sums it up. I quote, "From mainstreaming climate change into national planning to appointing senior military authorities to lead on climate change within the Defence Force, the UK and US governments have directed their militaries to rapidly prepare for climate change and its impacts," unquote. The Australian defence establishment is also working hard to coordinate its climate security strategy with the US and UK. This is indeed one of its publicly stated goals. This is, of course, in marked contrast to the stance of the political leadership of that country, which has been largely denialist in recent years. Clearly, despite the deep public divisions in these countries, there is no denial or confusion about global warming within their military establishments. To the contrary, there is every indication that their political elites and security structures have tacitly adopted a common approach to climate change. But is it conceivable that any branch of government in an open society would silently adopt a posture on a matter of such importance? That surely is not how liberal democracies are supposed to work. But have they ever really worked as they were supposed to? It is in the colonies, as Sartre once said, that the truths of the metropolis are most visible. And it is a fact, certainly, that when it came to empire, the forms of statecraft that Britain applied were quite different from those of the metropole. This fissure was laid bare as far back as 1788, when Warren Hastings, the former governor of Bengal, was impeached by Edmund Burke on counts that amounted precisely to the charge that Hastings' statecraft in India represented an affront to the British political system. With the acquittal of Warren Hastings, the split came to be embedded at the heart of the imperial practices of the Anglosphere. Through the 19th century and much of the 20th, the statecraft that England and her settler colonies practiced in their dealings with non-Europeans was of an entirely different order from that which obtained domestically. Outside metropolitan areas, the functioning of power was always guided, in the first instance, by considerations of security. The maintenance of dominance outweighed any other imperative of governance, and it was towards these ends that statecraft was primarily oriented. When seen through this prism, it does not seem at all improbable that certain organs of state, particularly the security establishment, would adopt an approach that is quite different from that of the domestic political sphere. Global warming is unique, after all, in that it is simultaneously a domestic and global crisis. A bifurcation of responses is only to be expected. Moreover, the climate crisis holds the potential of drastically reordering the global distribution of power as well as wealth. I noted earlier that in the carbon economy, our power is closely correlated to emissions. It follows that a curb on emissions will therefore amount to a curtailment of power. The realities of the carbon economy are such, then, that the curbing of the emissions of some countries and a rise in the emissions of others will lead inevitably to a redistribution of global power. That the rise in the international influence of China and India has coincided with a spurt in their greenhouse gas emissions is certainly no coincidence. This has significant implications for the dynamics of international carbon politics. Consider, for example, the idea of climate justice. Many practical strategies for a more equitable distribution of emissions have been proposed. One such is contraction and convergence. Another is a per capita climate accord, and so on. Now, equity is, of course, a highly desirable end in terms of justice, which is why it can never be publicly disavowed. After all, justice lies at the heart of all contemporary claims of political legitimacy. But from the point of view of a strategist whose guiding imperative is the maintenance of dominance, the recalibration of global power that would result from a convergence in emissions is precisely the scenario that is most greatly to be feared. From this point of view, the continuance of the status quo is the most desirable of outcomes. What sort of approach to climate change might result if these objectives are kept in mind? Some of its contours are already discernible. In one of its aspects, it will be geared towards the watering down of international emissions treaties and to holding mandatory reductions to a minimum, while essentially ignoring issues of historic responsibility and justice. But these will be only the passive elements of the approach. The proactive aspect of it will lie in the adoption of what Christian Parenti calls the politics of the armed lifeboat, a posture that combines, I quote, preparations for open-ended counterinsurgency, militarized borders, and aggressive anti-immigrant policing. That this will spell doom for millions in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere goes without saying. But this Darwinian approach is, in fact, in complete consonance with free market ideology. That perhaps is why it has a long pedigree in the statecraft of the Anglosphere. Lest this seem far-fetched, let us recall that this is not the first time that British and American officialdom has had to confront catastrophes brought on by vagaries of climate. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, El Nino events caused enormous disruption in India and the Philippines. And as Mike Davis has shown in his remarkable study, Late Victorian Holocausts, in dealing with drought and famines, British and American colonial officials consistently placed far greater store on the sanctity of the free market than on human life. Malthusian ideas were also often invoked in the context of famine and starvation in Asia and Africa, as, for example, by Winston Churchill when he said, quote, famine or no famine, Indians will breed like rabbits, unquote. Although we are unlikely to hear words of this kind in our era, there can be little doubt that there are many who believe that a Malthusian correction is the only hope for the continuance of our way of life. From this perspective, global inaction on climate change is by no means the result of confusion or denialism or a lack of planning. To the contrary, the maintenance of the status quo is the plan. And it is quite likely that this plan commands widespread but tacit support in many Western countries. Significant sections of the electorate probably understand intuitively that climate change negotiations may have the effect of changing their country's standing in the world's hierarchies of power as well as wealth. This may indeed be the basis of their resistance to climate science in general. The refusal to acknowledge these realities sometimes lends an air of unreality to discussions of climate change. For instance, George Monbiot, whose work I admire, writes, I quote, "There is a good political reason for fairness. People are more willing to act if they perceive that everyone else is acting," unquote. The trouble with this in relation to climate justice is that acting will fall largely to the lot of Westerners. Ethiopians and Bangladeshis emit so little that very, very few will have to act. This is an instance where the idea of fairness is unlikely to be a major incentive for action. In the technical literature on climate justice, similarly, and there's a huge body of literature now written by ethicists and economists, It is similarly assumed that everybody wants fairness and justice. Unfortunately, where it concerns relations between classes, nations, and races, this has never been the case. Nor is it only strategists who are blind to issues of justice that fall outside their own horizons. This affliction sometimes befalls writers as well. In 1938, the left-wing publisher Victor Gollancz published an anthology entitled Poems of Freedom, with an introduction by W.H. Auden. Reviewing the collection, the Indian critic R.K. Dasgupta observed, I quote, "In the whole volume, which contains 169 pieces, there is no direct and notable reference to India. It is strange that the English poets, who have shed tears over the oppressed peoples of Europe, who have indicted the ruthlessness of greedy capital and aggressive political enterprise, should maintain absolute silence regarding India. The fact is that we live in a world that has been profoundly shaped by empire and its disparities. Differentials of power between and within nations are probably greater today than they have ever been. These differentials are in turn closely related to carbon emissions. The distribution of power in the world therefore lies at the core of the climate crisis. This is indeed one of the greatest obstacles to mitigatory action, and all the more so because it remains largely unacknowledged. I suspect that this question will be even more difficult to resolve than economic matters like compensation, carbon budgets, and so on. We do at least possess a vocabulary, a very complicated one at that, for addressing economic matters. Within the current system of international relations, there is no language in which questions related to the equitable distribution of power can be openly and frankly addressed. These are some of the reasons why I differ with Naomi Klein and others who identify capitalism as the principal fault line on the landscape of climate change. It seems to me that this landscape is riven by two interconnected but equally important rifts, each of which follows a trajectory of its own. These are capitalism and empire, if the latter be understood to consist of the embedding of the aspiration to dominance within some of the most important structures of the world's most powerful states. In short, even if capitalism were to be magically transformed tomorrow, the imperatives of political and military dominance would remain a significant obstacle to progress on mitigatory action. But this aside, I'm completely in agreement with Naomi Klein and the millions of others in the Anglosphere and elsewhere who have come to recognize that this crisis cannot be met without changing everything. And by this, I mean not just our political and economic arrangements, but also our habits of thinking, teaching, writing, and indeed, imagining. The cynicism of the politics of the armed lifeboat is matched on the other side by the strategy that the elites of some large developing countries like India seem to be inclining towards, a politics of attrition. The assumption underlying this is that the populations of poor nations, because they're accustomed to hardship, possess the capacity to absorb, even if at great cost, certain shocks and stresses that might cripple rich nations. This may not be as delusional as it sounds. It is not impossible, for instance, that in dealing with situations of extraordinary stress, the very factors that are considered advantages in coping with extreme weather, education, wealth, and a high degree of social organization, may actually become vulnerabilities. Western food production, for instance, is dangerously resource-intensive, requiring something in the range of 12 fossil fuel calories for each food calorie. And Western food distribution systems are so complex that small breakdowns can lead to cascading consequences that end in complete collapse, as happened in New Orleans after Katrina. Similarly, power failures are so rare in advanced countries that they cause much greater disruption, including spikes in rates of crime when they do occur. In many parts of the global south, breakdowns are a way of life, and everybody is used to improvisations and workarounds. In poor countries, even the middle classes are accustomed to coping with shortages and discomforts of all sorts. In the West, wealth and habits based upon efficient infrastructures may have narrowed the threshold of bearable pain to a point where relatively small shocks could lead to systemic stress. Moreover, ties of community are still strong through the global South. People who are completely cut off from others are relatively rare. This too is a safety net of a kind. Recent experience shows that the absence of community networks can greatly amplify the impact of extreme weather events. Thus, for instance, after the European heat wave of 2003, an event which exacted an astonishingly high toll in fatalities, it was found that many of the dead were elderly people living in isolation. In short, the rich have much to lose, the poor do not. This is true not just of international relations, but also of the internal structure of the developing world, where the urban middle classes often have a carbon footprint that is not much lower than that of their counterparts in the West. However, it is not the middle classes and the political elites of the global South that will bear the brunt of the suffering, but rather the poor and the disempowered. This too is a brake on effective progress in climate negotiations. The belief that they are not gambling with their own lives is, no doubt, just as important a factor for the political elites of the developing world as it is for their counterparts in the West. It is therefore not as unrealistic as it may seem to assume that poor countries will be able to force rich countries to make greater concessions merely by absorbing the impacts of climate change, at no matter what cost. These considerations are, as I have noted, just as cynical as those that underlie the politics of the armed lifeboat. Yet it is hard also to determine what an ethical strategy might be for poor countries like India. Should they perhaps abandon the quest for Western-style prosperity so that a greater number will survive to take the struggle for justice forward in some uncertain future? But this would require an abandoning also of the project of modernization that was often implicit in decolonization. It would be to return to a system of colonial-style inequality. In any case, who could possibly make a convincing case for the poor to make sacrifices so that the rich can continue to enjoy the fruits of their wealth? To do so would be an acknowledgement that the ideas of equality and justice from which the dominant political imaginary draws its legitimacy have never been anything other than grotesque fictions designed to secure exactly the opposite of those professed ends. This perhaps is why such a case is never explicitly made, but only implied by euphemistic exhortations that urge poor countries to take a different road to development and so on. A striking example is that of the use of coal. Much concern has been expressed in the West about coal plants in India. Yet analysts have calculated that in 2014, the average Indian accounted for around 20% of the average American's coal consumption and around 34% of those from the European Union. The logical and equitable response then is for the US and the European Union to shut down one of their coal plants every time a new plant is commissioned in India until a convergence occurs. Is this likely to happen? Suffice it to say that it is extremely unlikely. This then is another way in which the terrain of global warming has been shaped not just by capitalism, but also by empire. The impetus for industrialization in much of the world was a part of the trajectory of decolonization, and the historical legacy of those conflicts are embedded also in the context of climate change negotiations. As a result, these negotiations now resemble a form of high-stakes gambling in which catastrophe is the trump card that is expected to make the other side fold. On the bleak terrain of climate change, the only feature that stands out in relief is, I think, the increasing involvement of religious groups and leaders. Pope Francis is, of course, the most prominent example, but some Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, and other groups and organizations have also recently voiced their concern. I take this to be a sign of hope not because I am a believer, but because it is increasingly clear to me that the formal political structures of our time are incapable of confronting this crisis on their own. The reason for this is simple. The basic building block of these structures is the nation-state, inherent to the nature of which is the pursuit of the interests of a particular group of people. So powerful is this imperative that even transnational groupings of nation states, like the UN, seem to be unable to overcome it. If a significant breakthrough is to be achieved, if the securitization of climate change is to be prevented, then organizations that already exist will have to be in the forefront of the struggle. And of such organizations, those with religious affiliations possess the ability to mobilize people in far greater numbers than any others. Moreover, religions are not subject to the limitations that have made climate change such a challenge for our existing institutions of governance. They transcend nation states, and they all acknowledge intergenerational, long-term responsibilities. They do not partake of economistic ways of thinking, and are therefore capable of imagining nonlinear change, catastrophe in other words, in ways that are perhaps closed to the forms of reason deployed by contemporary nation states. Finally, it is impossible to see any way out of this crisis without an acceptance of limits and limitations. And this, in turn, is, I think, very closely related to the idea of the sacred, however one may wish to conceive of it. If religious groupings around the world can join hands with popular movements, they may well be able to provide the momentum that is needed for the nations of the world to move forward on drastically reducing emissions without sacrificing considerations of equity. That activists like Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, and many others are already proceeding in this direction is, to me, yet another sign of hope. The struggle for action will no doubt be difficult and hard-fought, and no matter what it achieves, it is probably already too late to avoid some serious disruptions of the global climate. But I like to believe that out of this struggle will be born a generation that will be able to look upon the world with clearer eyes than those who preceded them, that they will be able to transcend the isolation in which humanity was entrapped in the time of its derangement, and rediscover their kinship with other beings, and that this vision, at once new and ancient, will find its most perfect expression in a transformed and renewed art and literature. Thank you. Thank you. If you have questions, there's a question right here.
Thank you. Amitav, first of all, I want to thank you for 4 very powerful, stimulating, thought-provoking lectures, which sometimes were also very brave. And you spoke with a lot of conviction. And we've all benefited from these lectures and what you stood for.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
Thank you from all of us. But having listened to all 4, I have 2 quick questions, and which relate to the broad arc of the structure of these lectures. I was quite taken with the empire argument that you were developing, particularly from yesterday's lecture on. And I agree with you. There's almost something like what one can call loosely an Anglo form of capitalism, and its roots go back to the beginning of British Empire. There's no question. And that is a very historical phenomenon, and I think you've tracked it very, very nicely. And I take that the distinction between empire and capitalism is a useful one, and can be developed further. So that's been one part of the argument. The other argument that you make in the first couple of lectures was actually the question of representation, the problem of representing climate change in the novel form. And I was thinking that since the novel form is much more heterogeneous in its origins and goes far beyond the Anglosphere, so one thinks of the great Russian novelist,
Yes.
of Joyce, of Indian novelist, of Latin American novelist. So the question then, the first question I had is something more than the Anglosphere involved in the problem of representation that the novelist faces? Whereas the historian in you, in trying to find a more causal structure, then sort of fell back on a very on a historical argument that was focused more on the Anglosphere, as you yesterday acknowledged about the whole question of leaving Latin America out of this in this history. So that's one question. And the second question is this. As you will acknowledge, and as comes out from everything you've said, empires have never been altruistic ventures. So even forget climate change. If you ever made an argument to an empire for global action, which was couched purely in terms of inequality, inequities, and the moral historical responsibility of the empire, I mean, the argument as such probably wouldn't move the empire very far, because the empire would also be involved in realpolitik, in shoring up its own interests. So long as India and China and Tuvalu and all these other places do not have the political clout to actually push the Anglospheric countries towards a more equitable world order, there are several options that open up. If they don't, India and China may eventually belong to a club of the global rich. The Anglosphere might include them, and the global poor can suffer. There could be contestation, as Clive Hamilton has shown on the book on geoengineering, between the Anglospheric ways of combating climate change versus Chinese or Indian. The world could be more conflict-ridden. The world could have a compact between these powers. But intellectually, don't you think there is some room for the argument that since a moral argument, even if it's true or partially true, cannot ever act as an incentive, a fully compelling incentive for a structure of domination that is already based on self-interest, there's always room there, therefore, to create a differentiated, but a larger argument which somehow has to make the point that the climate crisis is a crisis differentially for everyone. In other words, there could be an argument that says that the Anglosphere cannot win this game, except for making short-term gains. And this is precisely the argument that, say, Jim Hansen makes when he's saying storms for our grandchildren. He's not saying storms for my Indian friends' grandchildren. He's saying storms for our grandchildren, or my grandchildren. So it seems to me that there is intellectually a space there for developing a moral argument which can recognize historical inequities and responsibilities, and yet be able to argue that this is a crisis for everyone.
Very good questions. And let me say, to begin with, that of course, as you know, as has been evident, my thinking on these subjects has been very powerfully influenced by yours. So I feel very grateful to you for that, and it's a privilege to be presenting these in your presence. The first argument, the first question first, that is there, because of its heterogeneity of form, can the novel provide us with resources to represent what is underway? I do think it can, yes, because the heterogeneity of form actually goes much, much deeper than than is acknowledged. Because if you think of the traditional Chinese novel, and for me, I read, for example, the Bhagavad Puran as a novel, as fiction, and it really works like that. There's a sort of depiction of character, there's dialogue, there's all those things. So there are multiple sorts of ways, there are multiple legacies of the novel that we can draw upon, and certainly I think that is absolutely right. The second question, the question of the moral, which has really come to sort of obsess me in this, at the heart of this, because, see, I think when we speak of the moral now, we are investing the word with a greater load that it can carry. What are we really saying when we say that it's a moral issue? And, Naomi Klein, even Michael Mann, the scientist, and so on, increasingly use this rhetorical strategy of investing the climate crisis with this moral aspect. And look, I have no problem with that. I think rhetorically, it's perhaps a good move, perhaps the only move that can work at this point for a lot of people. But I think we must recognize also that there are pitfalls in this, As soon as you present climate change as a moral issue, you are taking on a politics of sincerity. And you're handing your opponent a ready-made answer, which is to say, what are you doing about climate change? So it becomes immediately personalized. The whole argument becomes then one about hypocrisy, Al Gore's hypocrisy because he has 50 light bulbs, or, I mean, I saw similarly how easily this argument can be deployed. During that climate march, they were interviewing one of the Kennedys, one of the young Kennedys, and he was talking about climate change, why we need to do something, and the reporter just said to him, "What are you doing about climate change? How did you fly here?" And so on. And he was completely flummoxed. I mean, he couldn't bring himself to say that this is a collective problem. It is. So I would say to that yes, if you can use the moral argument to mobilize people, please go ahead. But we cannot forget that this is essentially a political problem. Let me just finish. So that's one. Secondly, look. This battle of trying to fight a certain kind of capitalism with a politics of sincerity has been tried. It was tried by one of the greatest politicians who ever lived, which is Gandhi. And Gandhi failed. He achieved independence, but in this other struggle to create a different kind of economy, he failed. So there again, I think, we already see that the problems with this strategy. Finally, the thing I would want to say there is that, what frustrates me very much when I come to the climate change literature often, especially the literature written by ethicists and so on and so forth, is that, they're producing these elaborate models of climate justice and how it may work without ever acknowledging the reality of power in this world. And when you actually acknowledge the reality of power in this world, the moral questions that appear are completely different from the ones that they pose. So, for example, the moral question for me is, should India then say, should we as Indians acknowledge the reality of power and say that we will make our peace with this reality of power so long as we can have action on climate change, because that will save a large number of lives? That to me is a much, much more difficult moral question than the moral questions that they pose. Yes, sure. Yes, can you have the microphone again? Yes.
I won't take much.
No, sure.
No, I'm totally with you. Actually, my argument was, I was saying that the moral argument from India and China about historical responsibility, in effect, given the reality of power, becomes an argument about altruism. And that's where you don't get it. But I was trying to emphasize that the scientists are not necessarily making a moral argument. They're actually saying, if we don't become moral about it or wise about it, then we will all suffer. That's different.
Yes, sure. Yes.
I have two very different comments. To this last, I think maybe the effort is to convince those in power that they will suffer more. The higher you rise, the farther you fall. This entire nation would not exist if it were not for the slavery, and the rich are more in danger. We're more in danger, for example. So they fight harder. That's the point. We could point out somehow the potential loss to the wealthy if they don't participate in changing the system. My second is a little more lighthearted and personal. You presented at the end something I would have thought impossible, which is a sort of semi-utopian view of what may happen after what I will call the apocalypse in the meantime, if you don't mind. So I want to propose that you undertake the task with your next or second to next novel of presenting what you said couldn't be done in your first lecture, which is a future-oriented historical novel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know. I've been too accustomed to old ways of working. I don't know if I can adapt. But the other question about the rich, I think the rich, the powerful, are using a different calculus. They believe that they can ride it out, and that the poor, and that others will suffer more than them. Maybe they're deluded, maybe not, who knows? Yes. Yes, over here.
Thank you. I was wondering, just to go back to yesterday's lecture and then also the final point you arrived at today, if you could reflect a little bit more on what seems to be potentially a contradiction in the narrative that is often presented in political spheres about climate change, that we have to act for our children or our grandchildren. And when you talked about the one-child policy and a kind of counterfactual, if there was no one-child policy or if others adopted the one child, it seems to put those two things in kind of stark juxtaposition. A narrative that says we have to protect the planet for future generations, and future generations that themselves pose a escalating threat to the planet.
I think the argument about the one-child policy was that the future generations will be better able to sustain themselves if the population is stabilized. So that was my thinking about that. And there was another last question, the hand up over here. Yes. There's a mic coming to you.
I basically want to touch on this apparent opposition between the moral imperative and the question of brute force. So brute force here would be empire. And then basically the moral discourse becomes like a disguise for empire. You spoke about the dichotomy, I mean the opposition between what the security establishment is doing and what the political establishment is saying. So it's a kind of a hypocrisy, ultimately a form of self-deception. So could one way out be, in fact, a better alignment of the moral imperative and brute force? If you look talking about being on the wrong side of history, if you look at Vladimir Putin's response to Obama, he says, "Did you realize what you have done?" That's his question to the Anglosphere, actually. And immediately 2 days later, what happens in the Middle East, that is also a part of his response. So there you have brute force coupled with, one could perhaps argue that it is brute force coupled with a certain moral imperative as he sees it. And then the Anglosphere accuses him of trying to resuscitate the Russian Empire. And I think truth-telling, and in this relationship, truth-telling is also very important. I it's one of the best talks I've heard, truth-telling talk yours. I was really inspired. And it seems to me like, after Obama spoke for 40 minutes, and he spoke, taking much more than his time, Putin spoke just about 20 minutes, and much of the world saw this as sort of pricking the balloon of lying to oneself and lying to the world. I think much of the world saw that as the power of truth-telling, which is also what you did.
Well, it is a very striking thing how, in a way, this whole idea of the world as church, creates this mouthing of pieties, and this is what I see more and more within the public sphere, this constant mouthing of pieties, which is actually completely at odds with the actualities of the actions that are occurring. And I think we cannot go into this very dangerous future in this way, on the one hand, deluding ourselves with these pieties, and on the other hand, having to put together measures and actions, which measures and actions are being taken, whether we like it or not. So thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Clearly, there is a great deal more to discuss, and I want to point out that this was the intention that Randy and Melvin Berlin had in envisioning this series, that it would engage humanistic inquiry across the spectrum. One of the manifestations of this is that in order to do something like justice to these lectures, we have had introducers from history in South Asia, Dipesh Chakrabarty, from English and creative writing, Chiku Reddy, from English and cinema studies, Jim Chandler, from law and philosophy, Martha Nussbaum. I want to thank all of you for framing these conversations. I should have thought to invite somebody from the Divinity School, given your final comments about engaging religious movements. Certainly that would have rounded it out much more. Would you all please join me in thanking our outstanding speaker, Amitav Ghosh, for the second annual Randy and Melvin Berlin Family Lectures.
Thank you.